It's been said a lot over the past couple of years that politics has stopped being about left-wing versus right-wing and has started being something more about authoritarian versus libertarian. And there's certainly some truth to that. But I think that what we should be talking about is about political idealists versus political realists. I think that that divide is one that a lot better expresses what's really going on in the world today. So I'm going to take a shot at explaining that. There's a term that was introduced to me first through Henry Kissinger, which is the idea of realpolitik, which is the idea of practical politics. Politics that is concerned not so much with how the world should be, but what we can actually achieve. That's how it was first introduced to me, anyway, and that's an idea that stuck with me. It seemed bizarre to me that this wasn't something that every politician was trying to do, that not every politician who's been hopefully educated to some degree about what politics is and what it's trying to achieve isn't trying to do what they can. They aren't working towards some ephemeral utopian goal. They're just looking at the resources available and the courses of action available and deciding which is the best choice right now. That seemed bizarre to me. But that's pretty much the truth. Not just politicians, but people interested in politics as well. I think now more than ever we're seeing that there really is a huge band of idealists out there who are motivated more by what the world should be than any possible means of making that happen. I mean, a great example of this is communism, or any sort of hardline, very far leftist philosophy. It's a nice idea, this sort of socialist utopia, but that's not something that we can make happen. And even with great and strenuous efforts, even with political purges, even with a directly authoritarian regime trying to make this happen, you still can't make it happen. You can't get to the utopia. And yet, idealism is something that is quite attractive to us. I think it appeals to our higher nature. It appeals to the fantasist in us. It appeals to the side of us that likes to think about how things should be. And everyone likes to think that they and they alone know how things should be run. So idealism is quite attractive, especially if you have these kind of Western ideas about fair play, universal rights, things that we would like to see extended to everyone, everywhere in the world, that we think are right and proper and that everyone should have. These lead us towards idealism. This is something that you can see in every ill-guided idealist movement. Feminism is this strongly ideologically driven idealist movement built on the myth of a perfect gender-balanced utopia. Marxism is this ideologically driven idealist myth about a socially balanced, class-balanced utopia. These are things that should obviously be seen as ideologies, not as anything realistic, not as something that we can trust to make good decisions about the real world on the basis of their facts. In fact, anything that's built off of an inflexible ideology that cannot be bent around today's world, the facts that we see before us, if their answer would always only be more feminism or more Marxism in order to make the world better, regardless of what we actually see before us, then these are not people that we should be allowing to make decisions. These positions are all driven by ideology and ideology alone. They are following certain tenets that are mostly academic, that are mostly either disprovable or shaky, but they are an ideology that has coalesced and that people believe and follow. Ideology is what makes people ignore the real world, the possibility of realistic solutions, of making things better instead of making things perfect. That's an idea that's firmly entrenched in the idea of realism in politics and in international relations. The idea that we should make things as good as we can, but we shouldn't strive for perfection, because perfection is not something we're going to achieve when we're working with large numbers of people. All that we can do is make things as good as we can make them. We don't have infinite resources, we don't have infinite space, we don't have infinite jobs to hand to people. All we can do is create the circumstances which will allow the most people to be the most prosperous possible. The divide between feminists arguing that we need quotas of women in the boardroom and the realists, the normal, sensible human beings, saying no, we need the best people available to be in the boardroom, is very clearly shown to be one of ideology versus realism, of pragmatism versus religious nut jobs. It's still an authoritarian notion to command to businesses who they need to run their business. Absolutely. It's certainly still a liberal principle to say, no, we need to get the best person for the job. This is still, it's still reasonably well defined to say authoritarian versus libertarian, but at the core of the argument is not really about feminists just wanting to tell people what to do, although they do, but that's not really why. The reason that they feel they need to tell people what to do is because they have an ideology that those other people are not following. The idea of a free market is something that's a very liberal idea. It's this kind of laissez-faire, hands-off ideal of the world, and that good, popular things are going to rise to the top. And that's true, that is a liberal principle, but at its core it's a realist principle. This is not something that has moral value to it. This is not something that we should be clapping ourselves on the back for saying the market will sort things out. It's simply realism to say that supply and demand will determine an economy. Supply and demand will determine the value of skills, the value of people and their time. The market is not a partisan issue. The market is simply something that happens. That's why all arguments against the evils of the markets, the madness of markets, are made not by those who are necessarily on the political left. There is as much criticism from those on the political right. The argument is being made on the basis of their ideology, not on their political leanings. It would have to be, because it's only through ideology that you could be convinced that a market economy will not exist under any circumstances. Everywhere in the world there is always a market economy. Even in barter systems there's a market economy. Even in currency-less communist utopias there'll be a market economy. There has to be. There was in every communist country in the world. Black market goods were bought and sold. Foreign currency was on the same level as their domestic currency. There was a market economy for those who could afford it. Denying the market, denying the possibility of such a thing creating, using authoritarian powers to deny it, to force there not to be a market, is something that you could only arrive at driven totally by ideology. You don't have to be an authoritarian to be a feminist. You don't have to be an authoritarian to be a communist either. These are not ideas that in theory would have to be that. But because they deny real things, because they deny reality, they deny realism as an idea, they deny focusing on the real world as we see it happening, they have to become authoritarian practices driven by ideology. That's not to say that you could be an authoritarian realist to some degree. Realism has at times been accused of going too far, and it certainly has. Realism can be this very Machiavellian thing with interests only in personal interests instead of the interests of people, the good of the world, the wider population. And that's a problem. And you could almost argue that that Hitler was an authoritarian realist, in this very corporatist economy, and particularly playing the game of international realpolitik very well for quite a long time, figuring out who he could conquer and when. Realism is not something that has a moral stance. Realism is merely common sense. And if you're an evil person, you can use that to evil ends, to look at the world and say, how can I take these suckers for a ride? Just based off of knowing people, looking at people, understanding who they are and how they live, and thinking how you can best take advantage of them, And that's realism at its core. But that's defeated by realism as well, because realism accepts that some people will be bad people, and we need laws, and sometimes we need to use force to stop bad people doing bad things. Realism is not moral, it is not political, it's merely a point of view that sees the world off the basis of what we actually see in it today, instead of what we hope to see in it one day. What stung me to start talking about this today particularly was thinking about the upcoming UK referendum on the EU. I'm very, very much against the EU, by the way, and for reasons that hopefully are going to become clear as I explain this. Just reading up on the EU and thinking about how it works and what it does and how it's being used right now, it's very clear to me that this is something that's driven by ideology and by idealism, not by realism. It's not being driven by making Europe better for the people who live there. It's not being driven for the good of the European people at all. It's being driven to achieve some European ideal, some European superstate that can, I don't know, probably not conquer the world, but perhaps? Question mark? It certainly has this kind of European dream to it, that will make this pan-European state that can compete with China and America and India and South America on their own terms, that we can create this sort of single giant economy that ties everyone together. This is not a realist prospect. This is not something that we can reasonably suggest, okay, we'll just make France and Germany and Britain and Italy and Spain the same thing overnight. That's not going to happen. There's no way that could happen. Realist solutions are things like the European Common Market, things like that. Great idea. Schengen area, not a bad idea at all. NATO, great idea. All of these things that sort of tie countries together in reasonable ways, but that allow those individual nations to retain their own priorities and their own agendas, that don't expect them to simply no longer be British and French and German and Spanish and Italian. Those are realist solutions, but those have very much run their course. And the EU is now this sort of self-perpetuating ideological dream for the future that maybe one day will create a true European superstate that really will be a good thing. But that's a utopia. That's hundreds of years into the future. That's past the point where everyone in every European nation is speaking the same language, using the same currency, going to the same schools, where you could send one kid to school in France and the other one to school in Poland, and that would just be the way that you do things. This is not reality at all. This is a dream. This is a pipe dream. To take something current and quite pleasingly controversial, let's take the example of the present migrant crisis into the EU and what that reveals about what the EU is. The present EU response has been to say, we want to take as many people as possible. Economic migrants and refugees, will treat them exactly the same. We will let them come into Europe, live in Europe, work in Europe, stay in Europe for the whole rest of their lives. Hang the cost, we are gonna do this. That is an idealist standpoint. That is obviously an idealistic thing to do. That's a very ideologically driven point of view that they have adopted. They have decided that any possible downsides to this are irrelevant because their ideology, which is strongly multicultural, to invite as many people as possible from every culture possible, regardless of their compatibility with our own, that is something that is obviously, that is necessarily something driven by that multicultural ideology. In so many words, you can tell an idealistic point of view because somewhere in it says hang the cost. It says don't worry about any potential side effects. That's a very strong hint that we're going to see something ideologically driven coming out of it. Whenever we start to see answers that are fear-mongering, that are calling people racist just for talking about the consequences of decisions made, not even for bringing up race in their discussion, but simply to say an influx of migrants will have certain effects on our economy. That is indisputable. That is based off of what we can observe of economies and people and migration. And that is being called racist because those who stand for the EU, who stand for its dream, are ideologically driven. They believe that anyone who opposes their ideology is evil and must be stopped. Perhaps they don't think that in so many words, but that's very much what is being preached. That's what is being discussed. If you go to anywhere where the migrant crisis is being discussed, you'll see the progressives calling anyone who opposes mass immigration racist. Why? Why are they being called that? Think about what that knee-jerk reaction actually means if you break it down. To accuse someone of being racist means you do not have a reasonable argument, you just irrationally hate people of that race. That's what that means. To call any argument that is based in the real world, that is based off of observable facts in the real world racist, is to reveal that you are ideologically driven. You must be, because if you were a realist, making decisions off what is really happening in the real world, you would not call someone racist. You would correct their misconceptions. You would say, no, what is really in fact happening, if you look at this evidence, is something different to what you think. The only way that you could get to the point of calling someone else's realism-related views racist is if you are an ideologue who has no interest in the real world. And that is what the EU is. That is what proponents of the EU are today. For the record, for a long time I was a staunch defender of inter-EU migration. I thought that it was not necessarily a bad thing that large numbers of particularly Polish people came into the UK. My feelings were always that if someone's going to, move to somewhere for a better life and work hard, raise their family, pay their bills, not a problem. Don't have a problem with that whatsoever, because that's what I would do under the same circumstances. I think there's an argument to be had about the number of people that we allow in under, economic migration, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a thing that is just a natural function of being, a well-developed economy. People are going to want to come here, and we should let some of them do that. I'm not against the concept of immigration in the slightest. I think it's healthy, and I think that those of us who do live in more developed economies have a duty to share that with other people. I think that we should never be so solipsistic as to say, no, this is our part of the world, it is our walled garden of, good middle class white people, and no one else can ever hope to come and join us. I think that we should try and make space for those coming from abroad looking for a better life. But that needs to be done in realistic terms, in realistic numbers. Whenever we make these decisions, they need to be grounded in realism. We need to look at the number of people we have, the number of jobs we have, the amount of resources to go round, and decide how many more people can we support. It could never be racist to say we cannot afford to support any more people. There is a tendency by those on the ideological left to believe that we in the West can immediately solve all the world's ills, and even beyond that, that we are the cause of all the world's ills, and that we thus have a duty to solve them. These are both totally incorrect. We could not now, nor ever could we have, solved all the world's problems. We have more resources than some places in the world, and we should try and use those to good, but we do not have enough to solve everything. We do not have enough to solve every problem that is presented to us. We have resources, and with them we can do as much good as we can. That is a realist solution. That is simply common sense. And the only possible opposition to that notion is from ideologues who perhaps do not even see themselves as being such, but who are ideologues nevertheless, who oppose decision making off the basis of reality. In a different sphere, we would call people who make decisions based off of things not inherent in reality mentally ill. I'm the political animal, and everything I do is based in reality.